Global reserves just hit the lowest level since 1992, and somehow nobody's freaking out about it. There's no breaking news, no sweaty guy on CNBC, and no market panic. It's just been silence, which is weird. But there's also a reason why, and that's because it's been happening slowly and in the background. Because while everyone's busy arguing about whether AI is coming for their job, or whether Elon Musk is even human, the global financial system has been quietly rewiring itself, and most people have no idea what's happening. But before we can jump into why this matters, you first need to understand why being the global reserve currency is the United States' secret weapon. Because while on the surface, reserve currency status might sound boring, like it's something that only matters to Wall Street bankers who snack on nicotine pouches and live in $4,000 Soho apartment. But in reality, it's actually the invisible engine behind the United States economy. And that's because being the reserve currency is like being the backbone for the global financial system. It means that every other country needs your currency to do business. Basically, if countries want to buy oil, settle trade, or pay international debts, they likely need dollars to do so. So countries are forced to buy US bonds and hold dollars in their reserves, which means America has access to the cheapest capital on Earth. And it's estimated the US saves more than $200 billion annually just from this arrangement. It's the greatest financial cheat code in human history. Nobody voted for it. Nobody signed anything. It just fell into place after World War II, when most of Europe and Asia was rebuilding from scratch. The US was one of the last major economies still standing, and so the dollar became the default for global finance. But 70+ years later, and most people still assume this is a permanent thing, like gravity or taxes or Marvel making another Spider-Man movie, but it's not. And for the first time since World War II, alternative options are finally emerging. And the data tells the same story. Because in 2000, the dollar made up 71% of global reserve. It was the clear favorite, no contest. But by 2010, it had slipped to 66%. Still dominant, but something was moving. And today, it's below 58%. And here's where it gets interesting, because every major crisis has pushed the trend along a bit more, because after 2008, there was a short-term flight to safety to the US dollar. But the long-term effects were very different, because following the financial crisis and the Fed's quantitative easing program, central banks began asking a question they hadn't really asked before. Are we too concentrated in dollar-denominated assets? And then in 2014, the US imposed sanctions on Russia, and now countries were asking another question. What happens if Washington decides we can't use dollars either? And this kicked off the Russia-China partnership, because for the first time there was a serious push toward building alternatives to the dollar, and more importantly to the entire US financial infrastructure. It's where systems like CIPS start to emerge, systems built from the ground up with one goal root around US dependence. And then came 2022. The US and its allies did something that rewrote the unwritten rules of global finance. They froze roughly $300 billion in Russian sovereign assets and cut Russia off from SWIFT, which is essentially the WhatsApp for global banking. It's the messaging network that runs basically all international banking. And whether that was the right call or not is a video for another day. The point is that it sent a signal to every central bank on Earth that the financial system they depend on can be switched off at any moment if they go against Washington. And now central banks were starting to look at their dollar holdings and thinking maybe we need some backup plans. Because for decades, if you were a central bank trying to settle a trade between, say, Brazil and China, two countries with no connection to the United States, you had one option: route it through New York through dollar correspondent banking, through US regulated infrastructure. So every trade, every payment, and every settlement touched the American financial system, and not because anyone preferred it, just because there was nothing else. There were no other liquid markets for these transactions. So both central banks would hold accounts at a correspondent bank in New York like JP Morgan or Citi, and they would facilitate the transaction. And this arrangement effectively turned the US financial system into the foundation of the entire global financial system. And with this came massive unfair advantages. Advantages economists call exorbitant privilege, which can be broken down into three pillars. First, intelligence. Because when a trade between Brazil and China clears through New York, it doesn't just move money, it moves data. and it gives the U.S. visibility into seeing who's buying and who's shipping what. It basically gives the United States a bird's eye view over global trade. And the second pillar, investment. Because every country needs dollars to trade, and countries can't just store cash under a mattress. Treasury bonds had constant demand, which forced the world to buy our debt and let the U.S. borrow money at significantly lower interest rates than other nations. And finally, jurisdiction. Because trades ran through New York, it enabled the United States to act as the supreme regulator, like we saw in 2022 when the U.S. froze $300 billion in Russian assets. So this whole system the United States built wasn't about empowering global trade. It was about power. It was about building infrastructure that allowed for global control, and other countries finally had enough. But you can't replace these things overnight. It takes a coordinated multi-country effort.